U.S. Air Force is involved in this now. Talk about that.
Yeah. So at the very beginning of Trump's second term, there was the Air Force did a couple removal flights, mostly on C-17s, and it seemed like they were just sort of doing it for show. It's super expensive to remove people on a military flight. And, the military needs those planes. So those mostly dropped off. Last summer, the Coast Guard started doing a lot of ICE flights. Those were mostly domestic. Now, the Coast Guard is part of the military, technically, but they're administered by DHS. So, that's why that happened. So they did hundreds of flights up until April. Those stopped in April, and those were all domestic, these shuffle flights. But it looks like starting on June 4th, the Air Force started doing flights from Harlingen, Texas to Honduras and back, removal flights. And they've done dozens of them. So the first 3 were third country removals. Honduras's third country removal deal is for Spanish-speaking people from Latin American and Caribbean countries. And so that's who, would have been removed on those flights. After that, we don't know. There isn't really any information. These planes, it's not right to say that like they're flying dark or they're flying without their transponders. There's different types of transponder signals, but these planes are not using, most of the time, are not using the most common type of signal. It's called ADS-B for all the aviation heads out there. And so they're harder to track.
Yeah.
And they're just, and because their registration numbers are constantly changing,
they're
just harder for us to notice.
130s? I mean, what are they?
So the first 2 were on C-17s, which is a very big cargo plane. Yeah. All of them since then have been on C-130s, which is actually, it's like the Hercules or the Super Hercules. It's a prop plane. No, it's a big prop plane, but it's a prop plane. And it's, they're pretty versatile. They're used for cargo, but they can be used for transport of people, for search and rescue. So yeah, all the subsequent ones have been C-130s. So I just spent a couple of days. Like I said, they're harder to track than the other ICE flights. Trying to, going through 2 months of flight data, trying to catch as many as I could. And I found at least 30. There was another one yesterday. So
really expensive. Wow.
Incredibly expensive.
Okay. So speaking of expenses, I think there's been a bunch of reporting about $464 million spent to buy a fleet of planes for. Yeah. But these were the ones that we saw pictures of with Kristi Noem was there with the golden bathrooms and the bed. But they seem to strip those out now. What is it with this flight and these planes, and who's flying them, and how do they figure out who's going to fly them, and what are they doing?
This is such a long and complicated saga. Let me start with William Walters III. He's a former State Department physician. He left during the Biden administration. He seems to have gone MAGA, started all these shell companies, and at the end of Biden's administration, contributed to some Kristi Noem PACs. He got some like America First Award at Mar-a-Lago right after Trump won again, when he was president-elect again. And all of his shell companies, once Trump came in, started getting these massive contracts for voluntary removal programs and for purchasing planes for DHS's own deportation fleet. Their claim is that it will cost less for them to operate their own fleet of deportation jets instead of relying on charters. This is not true at all. It's anyone who's ever worked in aviation can tell you that's not true. A lot of activists and flight trackers like me have been sort of watching these planes since last December. So there's different groups of these planes, but they all go back to shell companies connected to William Walters. There's, the bedroom jet, the luxury 737 that a lot of people have heard about. but there are 2 Gulfstream 650s. They're like, private business jet. And then there are 7 737 passenger jets that they bought from Avello, from their former deportation charter.
Yeah.
I've heard from a source at Avello that they were paid a huge sum, much more than the planes were worth. This all happened at the end of December and early January, and then a couple more in March. And they were paid more than they were worth because it was like a rush sale. Like, we need these immediately. The planes went to Lake Charles, Louisiana, which is where you go if you're going to get your plane renovated, and have mostly just sat there since. Now, we've seen that these shell companies have tried to hire crew for these planes. They've been trying since at least February. And something that I and others predicted at the time is that that wasn't going to work. That it's actually really hard to stand up an airline, especially if you have no aviation experience like William Walters does not. So that's been going on forever. So the New York Times, Farenthold there just published a story 2 days ago. They finally figured out how much all of these cost, where those contracts were. They're hard to find. And it was, $464 million for all of these planes. And then in late June, early July, it seems like DHS finally realized that Walters wasn't going to be able to deliver the goods. And so they put out a statement of work asking for contractors to bid to operate these planes. We will provide government-owned deportation planes, but we need a company to operate them, which is, what we've been saying this whole time. And there was this very strange provision, if you looked closely at the contract, that most people miss, but there's one guy, Charles R. Davis, at the readout who first noticed it, saying that they wanted this contractor who operated the planes to also open up international staging areas, which they also called detention centers, in other countries that could hold up to 1,000 people. So now we're talking about setting up our own foreign gulags. This is something
at home. We want it where we won't let Congress look. We want it where they don't even know where they are.
Right.
Wow.
Right. We want to set up our own seacoats. So just yesterday, the contract was awarded to Eastern Air Express, which is a subsidiary of Eastern Airlines. And that's the subsidiary that operates 737s, which are the same aircraft that DHS bought from Avello. I asked them yesterday if the contract is in the 200 to 300 million, up to 300 and something million. I forget the exact number at the moment. I've asked Eastern if the contract is going to include setting up these staging areas, and have not gotten a response. I've never gotten a response to them. They don't really talk to me much. Don't know why.